Hello, everybody. It's Graham here. Monday evening here in Singapore. And today is Podcasting for Brands Live, where I want to share with you some of the latest data in podcasting. What's going on in the world? Where are the hot markets? Where are the growth markets? Because when we talk about podcasting, pretty much everybody thinks of podcasting in the context of the US, because the US was obviously one of the early markets in podcasting and it helped us get it in the game. But it's no longer the biggest market for sure. So I want to share with you some data today. So coming up, data on not just the US, but the fastest growing markets in the world. We'll keep it short today. I'll take questions, comments. If you have comments about the data, happy to talk about them. You know what to do. Just put your question in the comment box on LinkedIn. I'll do my best in the short time we have together to answer your comments about podcasting for brands. So let's fire this bad boy up. Let's have a look at some of the latest data on podcasting for brands. So this is our data, which was gleaned from multiple industry sources and really helps us understand where we are in podcasting today. We are in 2021 crossing 1 billion listeners every week. If we can zoom in on this data, we can have a look at really where the growth markets are. So interestingly, Asia Pacific comprises almost 2/3 of the global listenership in the world. China and India account for 45%. So really, if you are in podcasts, half of your market is in China and India, even though in China they don't call them podcasts, slightly different. And it may be a harder market to get into, but we cannot discount India and where that is going. India crosses 100 million subscribers. So this is really where the growth is happening right now. And if you think about the sheer numbers where we are in these markets, look, for example, at the data published by McKinsey just last year, that by 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be living in Asia. Think about that in the context of marketing, communications. What does that mean? It basically means that if you look at this data here, if you look at that the connection between the world's middle classes and podcasting is very strong. 2/3 of the world's middle class will be living in Asia. That means, it means that twice as many middle class will be living in Asia than anywhere else in the world combined. So for marketing and for communications, Asia Pacific is going to be an extremely important market, not just for marketing, but also for podcasting. And really what I want to show today is where is the growth happening. If you look at North America, for example, North America is just 10% of the global podcast market. Latin America is as big as North America. Europe is the second largest podcast market in the world. What does this mean? Well, qualitatively, these markets are different. However, quantitatively, you can see that Asia and Europe, Latin America, North America are, in that order, the most important markets. Qualitatively, obviously, North America is more advanced in terms of the advertising model, listener expectations, and also budgets. Here in Asia, a little bit behind. However, I will put it to you, and this is in our report, that the most advanced market in the world isn't North America. The most advanced podcast market in the world is Korea. And you look at the data that the Korean market, over 60% of the adult population listen to podcasts every week. 60% every week. That's phenomenal. So when people say Asians don't listen to podcasts, well, last time I looked, Korea was in Asia. So look at the data here. Things are changing, ladies and gentlemen. There is a fundamental shift. What Asia has been very good at historically is adopting the models of the West and making them better. And podcasts will be no different. So let me show you where the high growth markets are coming from in the world. This will be an interesting stat coming up next. Thanks for your comments, by the way. Thank you, Andrew, for your comments. Wonderful to see participation and any comment that comes in, any questions. Thank you very much, Andrew Turner, who runs a very good podcast, by the way, G&T Sessions. Check it out. I recommend it thoroughly. Korea, absolutely. Let's get the data up on where the markets are growing fastest in the world. And obviously the data I'm going to show is going to be a function of the size of these markets. Let's have a look. So India is the number one podcast growth market. So what that means is that the data I'm showing you now is net additions. What does that mean? It means how many extra listeners did this market add in 2021 or will add in 2021. So these are obviously predictions, but based on growth data from the previous few years. And what it's basically showing is that India is the fastest growing market in the world. India is growing almost at a speed of 40 to 50% a year. The numbers just add up. A couple of factors that you need to consider when looking at India is firstly the sheer size of the Indian market, 1.2 billion people. And remember that this is fundamentally an English-speaking market, and that so models from the West are easily imported into India. Secondly, the world's largest youth population, 600 million people under the age of 35. Just consider that. There are twice as many people under the age of 35 as there are people in the United States. Just think about that as an early adopter market. Obviously, this is a market with one of the largest digital talent pools in the world. The other factors to consider with India are related to the structural aspects of India as well. Firstly, a very well-established media market. Obviously, we all know about Bollywood, but there are many localized flavors of Bollywood in India. There isn't just Mumbai, but there are also, for example, Tamil media content out there, and very much localized, which is now reflecting in the podcast market. It's very interesting if you have a look at the data here, that what has happened in India is a combination of all of these factors. One, a large youth market. Secondly, COVID. The last year has hit India very hard and caused a very significant disruption in the economy and communications as well. So what's now happening is a lot of Indians are turning to podcasts as a way to create content, as a way to get their voices out there. And my long-term bet, things in India right now are a little bit in a state of flux because of where we are with COVID. But the long-term outlook for India is very positive when it comes to podcasting. I predict in 5 years, India will be the biggest podcast market in the world. And therefore, anybody who is serious about podcasting must also be serious about India. Think about the opportunities for anybody who is an IP license owner, the opportunity to reformat and license a format into the Indian market. So for example, if you're in the UK, you're servicing a market of 60 million people. Look at the under 35 population. That's about 25 million people in the UK to 30 million maximum. If you now take that to India, potentially you're looking at a market 20 to 30 times bigger in terms of distribution. And it's an English-speaking market. It's an educated market as well. So my long-term bet on podcasting is India. I think this is going to be one of the most interesting and fundamentally disruptive markets, because if you as a content distributor, owner, agency can crack the Indian market, then the long-term outlook is very good. And it also is important to realize this isn't just about marketing and advertising. And this is what I want to talk about next. If you think about the global market value of podcasting, when we talk about podcasting, a lot of the content definitions are derived from advertising. And that is a big market. There's some fantastic work happening in advertising right now. But I think this is just one part of a bigger piece of what podcasting can be. If we think about the ad market, roughly predictions just under $1.5 billion for global podcast advertising. If you think about the originals market, so if you think about advertising as one piece, the programmatic part of advertising, which is the inserts, the read-throughs, pre-roll, mid-roll, that's $1.5 billion. That's effectively competing with Google, Facebook, qualitatively different, but still competing with the programmatic advertising market. Branding market is slightly different. This is really yet to grow into its full potential. This will be competing with traditional big idea marketing and advertising. The domain of ad agencies, which I feel is more ripe for disruption, meaning that the idea of that era of Mad Men producing branding content, advertising in the modern era, in the digital era, that seems to be either going towards programmatic, or it's cannibalizing that sort of big idea branding awareness style content, or it's kind of staying where it is in the ad agency world. And I feel that the originals market is potentially a lot bigger, that market could be absorbed by a more effective way of engaging audiences. So this isn't actually advertising as we know it, the programmatic inserts. This is more of the branded content. And we're starting to see this market pick up. Now, if you think about those two markets as outlets for podcasting and what they're worth, I still feel we're just scratching the surface. And I want to share with you, just in conclusion today, where I feel that the real big opportunities lie in podcasting long term. I've talked about them geographically. I've talked about, for example, the geographic markets and where the growth is. We looked at Asia, looking at it in terms of the context of verticals and business case as well now, marketing, where I really feel the long-term opportunity is here. This is where I feel, this is my conviction. I'm not saying this is necessarily the only way of looking at podcasting, but it's a way that many people, I feel, have overlooked. And that is the PR market, worth approximately $150 billion annually. And the reason why my conviction is with podcasting in PR is this. Programmatic marketing, it's an extremely competitive market. You're competing with Google, Facebook, you're competing with all the programmatic networks, you're competing with pay-per-click, etc. And it's a very well-established market. There are many options that you have as a brand for buying advertising inventory. Originals is slightly bigger, but still it's the same problem. Do I sponsor a podcast, or do I sponsor an event, or do I sponsor an influencer? Whatever it may be, there's a lot of competition. And yet with PR, what is the competition really? The competition is press releases. Is that really what we're competing against? And if you look at podcast as a communications play, and particularly a leadership play for organizations, you look at, for example, the pre-digital world of communication, which is public relations and press releases and Rolodexes and analyst brunches and events. You look at that world, that is fundamentally ripe for disruption, because the question is that, are those entities delivering value in the modern post-digital world, post-COVID world. And I would put a massive question mark over their ability to deliver value using those old-fashioned techniques in a digital world. And the reason why they are still able to charge the fees that they do to brands is because of lack of choice, right? You look, for example, in the programmatic world, you look at in advertising, in the US, for example, Facebook and Google account for 59% of the advertising market. What is the equivalence of that in communications? Nothing. There is no competition. There is nobody who is able to offer a digital equivalent of Google, Facebook in the world of communications. That is until podcasts. Because I believe that what digital advertising and marketing did to the ad agencies, digital communications, i.e. podcasts, will do to the PR agencies. And the great news is that the best PR agencies will get on board and they will adapt and they will adopt. But not all of them. And this market is fundamentally ripe for disruption, especially when you look in the context of what we just talked about, Asia, because brands can leapfrog traditional agency relationships. The reason why many brands still go with traditional marketing and communications agencies are relationships, because they've been around for years. You know, I will never get fired for using Ogilvy. I will never get fired for using Edelman. I will never get fired for using name your ad agency. And in many cases, these guys do great work. However, they don't do the best work. And that's the point, that they can't be the best at everything all the time. And that's why in markets where there are no existing relationships, where there are fast emerging brands and consumers, especially young consumers, are willing to try and adapt and adopt new ways of communication, I feel that the market is most ripe for disruption. You know, people talk a lot about digital transformation. Digital transformation. Now, really, what is that? It's the changing shape of business. Think about that, because the word itself, transformation, change, formation, shape. It's the changing shape of business caused by digital. We've talked about digital transformation in innovation, but nobody's talking about digital transformation of communications. And that is what I believe we are entering now, because the digital transformation of communications is the changing shape of communications as an industry caused by digital. And digital communications is podcasts, ladies and gentlemen. That is digital. And so what's happening is podcasting will fundamentally disrupt communications. And the way it disrupts communications is it changes the shape of the way that we do communications. From the old model of communications, which is pipeline, to the new model of communications, which is platform. And that means that for PR agencies to stay relevant, it's not about adopting podcasts. That is digitalization, the adoption of technology as opposed to a mindset. For PR agencies to stay relevant, they don't need to just adopt podcasts. They need to change their mindsets. They need to change their mindsets from gatekeepers to enablers. PR agencies for the longest times have been the gatekeepers of information. Think about it. The whole model is based on efficiency and control. That pipeline of information that flows through from the brand to the destination, the media. It's a pipeline, and like a pipe, it needs to be controlled to make sure it doesn't leak, to make sure there is one monolithic narrative pushed onto the market. However, monolithic narratives no longer work. We don't live in a world where there is just one brand story. Think about it. Brand stories are like one bird in the tree. What I mean by that is the official narrative is just one of many, many unofficial narratives about your brand, who you are, and the story that you have to tell. Meaning PR agencies can no longer function by control, by gatekeeping. They have to function by curation and as a platform to enable all these different storytellers within organizations to tell their story in an authentic and human way. That's not how we've done PR for 50 years. So I put it to you now, the big opportunity in podcasts isn't necessarily in simply giving a podcast to a brand. The big opportunity in podcast is unlocking the human potential of that brand and giving everybody a voice. And I challenge you, PR agencies, that whether or not you are fundamentally set up to do that. And that will be interesting because it's like ad agencies in the old days, even though they got the need for digital, the model was top down. The model was about the big idea pushed onto the market. And therefore, it was the digital agencies that came in and cannibalized the work of the ad agencies. And I put it to you, the same is going to happen in public relations. That's what's happening now. We've seen Tesla. Tesla dumped their PR agency. So I think in the next 3 to 5 years, especially here in Asia, PR as a concept will struggle in the digital world unless it can move from digitalization to digital transformation. And it is a fundamentally different mindset. Thanks, guys. Today was about the opportunities in podcasting for brands. We went through some of the top level data. Hopefully that was useful for you. Let me read some of the comments. Jason Regan asks, curious where something like Clubhouse will fit in. This is a really interesting question. The way I see Clubhouse and podcast is working together. I look at podcasts in the same way we look at the music industry in the old days. Podcasts are the assets. You have to have a conversation asset. And also that is why I feel PR will struggle because it's owned media, not earned media, owned, not earned. Sorry, my accent. So music is the asset, the IP, podcast, the asset, the IP, but music needs airplay, and music needed the radio station. So I see podcasting and Clubhouse coming together in the same way the music industry needed radio because radio provided the airplay for the assets that they owned. If you can listen to radio now and hear the Beatles, you can hear the Beatles from 60 years ago, right? That shows you the power of an asset. And the same way with podcasts, you can discover podcasts like 10 years old. But Clubhouse, Discord, Fireside, Twitter Spaces, they're all going to be gone as airplay within minutes. We'll need them, but once they're done, like a webinar, if you like. You need both to have. So I think that those two will work very well together in the future. That model will emerge. Think of podcasting and Clubhouse like you think of music and radio. We'll take this comment from Sam Blizzard. Apologies if I got that wrong. Good to be reminded on the meaning of the word transformation. Agree too on the model of communications technology is changing the landscape fast around us. The new model, yeah. So the new model really for communications is based around changing shape. It's from pipeline to platform. We've seen this. It's the shift from efficiency to authenticity. Right. If you think about the old model of communications on which a lot of PR is built, it's based on handlers. It's based on optimized, efficient communication. So, for example, when you appear on media, it's very polished. You have the questions beforehand. You have a PR handler which says what you can ask, what you can't ask. Those days are over. Look at how people, for example, like Tony Fernandez from AirAsia communicate, or even Elon Musk for communicating, like to their audience. It's very human, very inefficient, but very authentic, and it works. And therefore, that's the new model of communications. And yet, if you think about traditional PR, has for many, many years been about crisis management. If you look at go and look at a PR event. Go and look at a public relations event, and you will see if it's a PR webinar or a PR conference, if they're still happening now, you'll see that most of the conversation topics at the conference are about crisis management, like your executive tweets, #China, what do you do now? Or how to manage PR meltdowns. So you see, that's the mindset of public relations. The mindset is about crisis control, which is about managing a pipeline. In the same way, if you managed an oil pipeline, you would be worried about leakages. You would be worried about somebody blowing it up. You'd be worried about terrorist attacks. You'd be worried about some idiot, like turning that stopcock and letting all the oil come out and creating a disaster, right? That's the mindset. If you dig stuff out of the ground, if your fundamental business model was digging stuff out of the ground, then your whole business modus operandus, is about building a fence around that hole, right? If you're an oil company, you want to protect your oil. If you're a miner, you want to protect your mine, right? And that's the fundamental model of public relations, digging stuff out of the ground. It's a pipeline. So the new model is different because you can't exist like that anymore. You have to accept that people will be authentic. People will say stupid things. Look at Elon, right? Elon tweets. All hell gets let loose. The share price is down. The share price is up. What do? Well, the point is now one of the most valuable brands in the world. You just got to let them do it. You got to give them green lights and guardrails, which is really the role of new communications. We need to move from control to curation, and that means giving people a sandbox to play in. And that's done with best practices, right? Let's take some more comments. Thanks a lot, Sam. Andrew, you're back. Let's take this one. Funny you say that. I was on a session with Scott Galloway. Cool. Prof G. Respect. I'm a big fan of Prof G. And he was saying his guidance for B2B software companies was use PR as a gangster move. He cited examples from Airbnb. But as you say, if you add podcasts to this as well, then boom. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Andrew. For B2B companies, particularly B2B, so we're talking like SaaS, software platforms. For B2B and startups as well, so, a lot of B2B companies think like startups. Think about their marketing. B2B marketing and communications is very similar. So B2B marketing and PR is not too dissimilar. PR in the modern communication sense, right? So the way B2B companies market themselves is as thought leaders, to own a narrative, if you like. And that's very much what communication should be doing today. So those two are very similar. So, when we talk to clients, If they're a B2B SaaS platform or they're a startup, then really there is no difference between communications and marketing. And if you think about it, in the context of communications, podcast, it does both for these guys, right? It's both an acquisition tool and an influence tool, right? The bigger you become, obviously, the more stratified, the more segmented the company becomes. And therefore you have like a comms play and then a marketing play for the podcast. But at that level where you're B2B, it's sort of a much more digitally native company, if you like. Comms and marketing are the same thing. And even if you look at, for example, what a lot of PR agencies struggle with now is digital marketing effectively, because their worlds are becoming very much interlinked with digital marketing and they're not prepared to do it. Think about it in the context of metrics. What are the metrics for communications today? Like if you're in marketing has all kinds of metrics and, metrics every single minute of the day. And yet in comms, PR, you might get share of voice once a year. That's like marketing back in 1998. We're like 20 years behind here in comms. So I love this idea from Prof G, using PR as a gangster move and, adding podcasts to that. That really should be it. I think, pretty much in the next 5 years in the digital space, it will only be podcasts for these kind of companies, because what are their alternatives? What are you going to do? Like do a press release, sponsor an event? Forget it. Like you're not going to see conferences come back for 18 months, not in the sense that we've seen them before, right? You're going to do an analyst brunch? Forget it. Ain't going to happen. So what are you going to do? And for these B2B companies, it's a fantastic opportunity, I feel. That's where the market's heading right now. Jerome says, really interesting facts, Graham. Thanks, Jerome. Thanks for joining. Hopefully that was useful for everybody. 30 minutes today. Time's up, folks. Hopefully you enjoyed podcasting for brands with me. I'll be back on Friday for the chart show, sharing with me. It's a bit late here. Sharing with you. Thanks for joining today. Sharing with you the latest, greatest podcasts in the world using our data. We're going to share some of the hot new entries in the podcast charts in the business space. What's hot, what's not, what's working, what's not working. That's on Friday. So we do Podcasting for Brands, the chart show on Friday. My name's Graham. You know where I am. You're on my LinkedIn feed. I'm on your LinkedIn feed. So just if you have any questions about podcasting for brands, anything about today's session, just hit me up. Just send me a message. I'd love to chat. As you can see, I like sharing information. So I'm happy to share more ideas and info with you. Thanks a lot for everybody in the comments today. A shout out to those who did comment. Double shout out to Andrew Turner, the G&T sessions. He's put a link in there. Go and check that out. That's a great podcast. Shout out to Jason Regan, Sam Blizzard. Apologies if I got it wrong. Jerome Tom. And lastly, David Bain. Last minute entry. Thank you very much. It's great to see all these podcasters out in force today. Wonderful, folks. Hopefully the information was good for you today and maybe give you some ideas about where we're heading with podcasts. And there'll be more. I'll be back every Monday on your LinkedIn feed and then on Friday doing the chart show. Thanks very much. Signing out.